The universe did not scream when it broke. It exhaled. Somewhere in the endless dark between galaxies, a wound opened without sound, without warning, without witness, and through that wound tumbled a body wrapped in the dying embers of a light no cosmos on this side had ever seen. The tear closed almost gently behind him, sealing away the roaring green sky he had left behind, leaving only silence and the slow drift of a Saiyan too exhausted to remember why he had been fighting. Broly fell for what felt like an age. Constellations he did not recognize slid past him with cold indifference. Stars burned in patterns his ancestors had never charted, and the deeper he drifted, the more he understood that something fundamental was missing. There was no hum beneath the vacuum, no pulse, no spiritual current threading itself through matter. The living breath of ki that had defined every world he had ever touched was simply absent here, and its absence pressed against his skin like winter. He came to rest on a small, forgotten moon orbiting a blue and green planet that shimmered with a fragile, hopeful kind of beauty. His body left a crater across the pale dust, and for a long while he did not move. He only stared at a sky full of unfamiliar suns and wondered, with a strange, quiet ache, whether this was another dream sent by the voice that had haunted his childhood. Far above him, satellites turned their patient eyes toward the disturbance. Numbers on distant monitors climbed past every safe threshold and kept climbing. In a room lit only by the glow of 100 screens, Cecil Stedman stood very still, one hand resting on the back of an empty chair, watching an energy signature that refused to belong to any known category. He did not shout. He did not curse. He simply murmured for someone to wake every asset the Global Defense Agency had ever hidden, and then he watched the readings climb again. He had spent his life preparing for impossible things: alien invasions, rogue Viltrumites, godlike experiments gone wrong. Yet this was different. This was a reading with no comparison, a fingerprint that did not match any biology, any technology, any radiation the Earth's instruments had ever catalogued. It was as though something older than physics had wandered into their solar system by mistake. Far across the galaxy, on a bridge polished by centuries of conquest, a Viltrumite scout felt his own instruments stutter. The energy that had touched the outer rim of civilized space was not muscle, not augmentation, not the biological inheritance his empire worshipped. It was potential, raw and unshaped, humming beneath a foreign sky. He reported quickly, precisely, and without embellishment, because embellishment was punished. Yet even his flat voice carried a tremor when he spoke the words unknown origin. Back on the moon, Broly finally stirred. He rose slowly, dust falling from his shoulders like the ash of an extinguished fire, and turned his gaze toward the blue world hanging in the black above him. He did not think of conquest. He did not think of vengeance. He thought only of the word that had never truly been given to him: home. He wondered if such a place could exist here, or whether he had merely traded one exile for another. He did not know that his heartbeat, quiet as it was, had already begun to bend the balance of this reality. He did not know that scientists were arguing over his existence, that satellites were locking coordinates, that an empire older than empires was turning its attention toward a single unnamed moon. He only knew that he was tired, and that for the first time in a long life of borrowed rage, no one was ordering him to destroy anything. Somewhere in a war room, Cecil whispered a command to prepare first contact. Somewhere in the void, a Viltrumite fleet adjusted its course. And somewhere between them, a lonely giant closed his eyes and listened to a universe that did not yet know his name. Mark Grayson had learned to expect the impossible, but nothing in his training prepared him for the figure kneeling in the crater. He had flown here beside a transport of armored specialists, listening to Cecil's voice crackle instructions through his earpiece, expecting hostility, expecting weapons, expecting the familiar choreography of another alien crisis. Instead, he found a man who looked as though he had been carved from grief and mountain stone, seated quietly in the dust, staring at his own hands as if trying to remember what they were for. Broly did not rise when the soldiers approached. He did not react when their rifles hummed to life or when the drones circled him with cautious precision. He only looked up, slowly, and met Mark's eyes with an expression that held no threat, only a strange and unguarded loneliness. Mark felt the air leave his chest. He had faced beings whose gaze could shatter satellites, yet this quiet stranger unsettled him more than any of them, because there was nothing performative about his silence. It was simply the silence of someone who had never been welcomed anywhere. Mark stepped forward and lifted his hands, palms open. He spoke the way his father had once spoken to frightened animals, softly, without hurry. He offered his name. He offered water. He offered a promise that no one here wanted to hurt him. Broly listened as though the words were a language he had almost forgotten. And after a long pause, he answered with a single syllable, his own name, rough as gravel and heavy as a confession. Behind the perimeter, robot sensors trembled against readings that refused to cooperate with any known model. He whispered into his console that this being did not radiate energy so much as remember it, as though power was something Broly carried rather than produced. Adam Eve stood at his shoulder, her fingers tingling with a strange resonance, and she murmured that the world's laws were bending politely around this stranger, the way a room quiets when someone important enters. Cecil watched from a bunker beneath the city, his jaw tight. He had already authorized 3 separate contingency protocols, each more terrible than the last. Orbital strikes, genetic pathogens, a dormant weapon buried beneath the Atlantic since the last Viltrumite scare. Every sensor confirmed the same conclusion, spoken again and again by analysts who did not want to say it aloud. The resting output of this creature, without effort, without transformation, without breath drawn in anger, already matched the projected yield of an extinction event. Yet on the surface, Mark was laughing. He had offered Broly a canteen, and Broly had accepted it with the delicacy of a man handling something sacred. He drank slowly, blinking at the taste of clean water, as though it were unfamiliar kindness. Mark spoke of Earth, of his mother, of the strange comfort of pancakes on Sunday mornings, and Broly listened without interruption. The soldiers lowered their rifles by degrees. The drone stopped circling. Something in the air softened. Farther out, beyond the reach of any earthly instrument, a Viltrumite intelligence report reached the ears of the Emperor himself. Thrag read the transcript twice, then a third time, his gloved fingers still. His analysts could not classify the newcomer. His scholars could not name the species. His warriors could not predict the outcome of a confrontation. For the first time in centuries, the Viltrum Empire hesitated, and hesitation in Thragg's world was a kind of wound. He gave a single order: observe, test. Do not engage until certainty is possible. Then he stood alone at a viewport of black glass and studied a distant blue star, wondering whether the galaxy had finally offered him a worthy rival or merely a disaster wearing the shape of one. On Earth, night fell over the crater. Mark sat cross-legged in the dirt beside Broly, uncertain whether he was making a friend or midwifing a catastrophe. He spoke of his father's mistakes, of the burden of inherited power, of the small daily terror of choosing to be good. Broly said little in return, yet when Mark finally rose to leave, the Saiyan reached out and touched his shoulder with a gentleness that seemed to surprise them both. For the first time in a very long time, Broly did not feel like a weapon. He felt like a guest. And somewhere above the atmosphere, a Viltrumite fleet quietly adjusted its heading. They came at dawn because the Viltrumites had always believed that terror was best served with light. 6 of them descended from the upper atmosphere like falling comets, their sonic booms rolling across the coastline in overlapping waves of thunder. There was no announcement, no ultimatum, no theater of diplomacy. Their orders were simple: provoke the anomaly, measure the response. Return with data, or do not return at all. Their first strike leveled a bridge. Their second cratered a rescue helicopter. Mark was in the air before the third impact, his voice hoarse from shouting warnings, his fists trembling with the old familiar ache of a fight he had not chosen. Around him, the sky filled with defenders, Adam Eve weaving pink walls of matter to shield fleeing crowds, robots, drones knitting the wounded together with mechanical mercy. It should have been enough. It had been enough before. But these Viltrumites moved with the coordinated brutality of a species that had rehearsed genocide for generations, and within minutes Mark tasted blood and understood that Earth alone could not hold this line. Then Broly arrived. He did not fly so much as step through the space between moments, appearing at the edge of the ruined bridge with dust curling around his boots. A Viltrumite fist descended toward a screaming child, and Broly caught it in his open palm without turning his head. The impact should have flattened a city. Instead, it produced a small, clean sound, like a bell struck once and stilled, and the Viltrumite's arm went utterly limp in his grip. Broly set the child down behind him with the same care he had once used to hold the canteen. The remaining Viltrumites regrouped. They struck in together, all 5 at once, with blows that had ended civilizations. Broly did not stagger. He did not bleed. He absorbed their fury the way a mountain absorbs weather, and when he finally lifted his hand to push them away, they tumbled through the air like children thrown from a swing. Even Thrag, watching through a distant relay, leaned forward in his chair with something that resembled reverence. Mark stared, breathless. He had never seen restraint used as a weapon before. Every motion Broly made was a refusal, a careful, deliberate refusal to become the thing his opponents wanted him to be. Yet Mark could see it in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw, in the faint tremor beneath his calm. Something inside Broly was pacing, testing its chains. The Viltrumites, wounded but not humbled, changed tactics. They turned toward the civilians. One of them seized a fleeing woman by the throat and lifted her toward the sky, smiling the flat, superior smile of an empire that had never been told no. Broly's breath caught. A single strand of hair lifted from his brow as though pulled by an unseen tide. Then the world learned what Kai was. It began as a green flicker along his knuckles, a color the Invincible universe had no name for. It spread across his shoulders, down his spine, out into the air around him, until the ground beneath his feet cracked in slow concentric rings. The sky above the coastline dimmed, not because clouds had gathered, but because his aura was drinking the light. Every hero within 100 miles staggered as an invisible pressure pressed upon their lungs. Continents away, seismographs trembled. Astronauts aboard distant stations felt their instruments panic. Robot, kneeling in the rubble, whispered that this was not radiation, not force, not any energy his models could name. It was, he said quietly, a language. Broly did not shout. He simply moved. The Viltrumite holding the woman was suddenly no longer holding her, and no one could quite recall the motion that had freed her. The others fled upward, their arrogance stripped away, their transmissions dissolving into static as they climbed. Broly watched them go with eyes that shimmered faintly green. And then, with visible effort, he closed his fists and pulled the light back into himself, breath by careful breath, until the ground stopped trembling and the sky returned. He turned to Mark, and his voice was very small. He said he was sorry. He said he had almost forgotten how to stop. Mark stepped forward through the settling dust and placed a hand against Broly's arm. He said nothing clever, nothing heroic. He simply stood there, letting his friend feel the weight of another living presence, and slowly, Broly's shoulders eased. Far away, in a chamber of black glass, Thrag rose from his chair. He had seen enough. Uncertainty, he decided, was a luxury the Empire could no longer afford. He would go to Earth himself. Thrag descended alone. No fleet accompanied him. No honor guard marked his approach. He came the way old gods once came to mortal kingdoms, unannounced and unarmored, wearing only the quiet certainty of a being who had never lost. His arrival split the clouds above the Pacific into a perfect ring, and every satellite in orbit turned its face away as though ashamed to record what was coming. He found Broly on a windswept cliff at the edge of a small fishing town, watching gulls trace lazy circles above the waves. Mark stood beside him, arms folded, jaw set. The two of them had spent the previous night talking about nothing in particular, about tides and constellations and the strange loneliness of being the strongest person in any room. Now that conversation felt very far away. Thrag did not attack. He landed softly on the grass, folded his hands behind his back, and studied Broly the way a sculptor studies a stone that has surprised him. When he finally spoke, his voice was warm, almost fraternal. He said that strength like this was wasted on a world that would never understand it. He said that empires were not built by men who apologized for their power. He said that Broly could stand beside him, not beneath him, and together they could remake the galaxy into something worthy of such gifts. Broly listened. He did not interrupt. When Thrag finished, Broly answered with a single quiet word, "Number." Mark stepped forward then, and his voice trembled with something fiercer than anger. He spoke of choice. He spoke of the small, stubborn dignity of ordinary lives. He said that a galaxy built on the backs of the weak was not an empire but a graveyard with better lighting. Thrag watched him with the patient amusement of a wolf listening to a lamb explain morality. When Mark finished, Thrag smiled, and the smile was the coldest thing Broly had ever seen in this universe. Then Thrag attacked. The first blow shattered the cliff. The second erased the fishing town's harbor. By the third, the sky was no longer the sky, only a churning bruise of displaced air. Broly met him strike for strike, and the world beneath their feet began to forget its own shape. Mountains folded, oceans rose in walls. Continents leaned toward the fight as if listening, yet Broly held back. Every punch he threw was measured, every step calculated to keep the ruin contained. Thrag noticed. Of course he noticed. He had spent 1,000 years learning the difference between a warrior in chains, and he recognized the shape of the leash Broly had placed upon himself. So Thrag reached for the leash. He broke from the duel mid-strike, streaking downward toward a coastal city that had already begun evacuating. He did not need to reach it. He only needed Broly to believe he might. He hovered above a school, above a hospital, above a plaza filled with people who had trusted their heroes to be enough. And he smiled that same cold smile up at the Saiyan hanging in the ruined sky. Something in Broly cracked. Mark saw it happen. He would remember it for the rest of his life. The green flicker returned, but this time it did not stop at the knuckles. It climbed. It climbed his arms, his chest, his throat, until his hair rose in a slow burning crown and his eyes became two silent suns. The clouds above him did not part. They simply left. The atmosphere itself seemed to step back a respectful distance, and reality took on the fragile hum of a bell that had been struck too hard. Legendary Super Saiyan. The name was unspoken here, unknown, yet every living thing on the planet understood it in the marrow. Thrag felt it first. His smile faltered, not from fear but from recognition. The deep and terrible recognition of a predator meeting something older than predation. He raised his fists anyway, because he was Thrag, and pride was the only god he had ever kept. Broly moved. The city beneath him was suddenly untouched. The plaza suddenly empty of the shadow that had threatened it, and Thrag was suddenly 100 miles above the ocean with blood on his teeth. He laughed once, a sharp, bright sound, and then he came again, because he had always come again. They fought until the horizon forgot which side was east. Yet even in his transformed state, Broly did not kill. He struck to end the fight, not the enemy. He struck to protect, not to punish. Mark watched from below, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face, and he understood at last that the true miracle was not the power. It was the refusal. Thrag withdrew before the sunset. He was not defeated. He was calculating. As he climbed back through the atmosphere, he whispered a single command into his private channel. Prepare the Empire for total war. The invasion did not begin with a fleet. It began with a promise, whispered across 1,000 Viltrumite worlds, that the age of hesitation was over. Within days, the stars above Earth grew crowded with unfamiliar lights, and within weeks the war had spilled outward, dragging distant civilizations into a conflict none of them had asked to inherit. Earth adapted with the desperate ingenuity of a species that had always been underestimated. Robots spent sleepless months translating what he had witnessed on the cliff, building resonance engines that hummed faintly green when Broly stood near them, weaving the impossible into the merely improbable. He shared his schematics openly, without patents, without price, and soon the sky above every continent was patrolled by defenders whose shields drew strength from a physics no textbook had yet dared to publish. Adam Eve changed too, though her changes were quieter. She had spent long evenings listening to Broly speak, haltingly, about the difference between forcing matter and asking it. She began to feel the difference in her own hands, in the way pink light bloomed from her fingertips with less resistance, less exhaustion, more grace. She learned to heal wounds she had once only bandaged. She learned to build shelters that sang softly to the frightened children inside them. Mark grew into something none of them had expected, least of all himself. He had always been a soldier by inheritance, a hero by obligation, a young man carrying a name that weighed more than his body. Now, standing at the center of coalitions he had helped to forge, speaking to alien admirals in Tung's robot, had taught him overnight. He began to move like a leader who had chosen the role, rather than one who had been drafted into it. He no longer flinched when strangers called him Invincible. He simply nodded and asked what they needed, and Broly became the symbol. He did not seek the role. He would have refused it if anyone had offered it aloud. Yet across every embattled world, refugees whispered his name as though it were a small, warm prayer. Children on distant moons drew pictures of a green-haired giant standing between their homes and the sky. Old soldiers who had lost faith in gods found themselves believing again, cautiously, in something they could not quite name. Where he walked, the war paused. Where he fought, the war retreated. Yet each victory left a mark inside him that no one but Mark could see. Every time he loosened the green fire, it took longer to gather it back. Every time he stared down a Viltrumite battalion, some small part of him remembered how easy it would be to simply not stop. He confessed this to Mark one night on the deck of a battered coalition cruiser, their legs dangling over the edge of a hangar bay, a nebula spilling violet light across their faces. He said he feared that winning might cost him more than losing. Mark did not offer platitudes. He simply told Broly about his mother, about the small kitchen in the small house, where she still baked bread on Sunday mornings, about how she had once said that family was not the people who shared your blood, but the people who chose to stand in the doorway when the storm came. Broly listened for a long time. Then he closed his eyes and let the nebula's light wash over him, and something in his shoulders loosened that had been tight for 1,000 years. Elsewhere, Thrag watched his empire begin to shift beneath him. Worlds he had ruled without question began asking questions. Officers he had trusted began to hesitate. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had never been sentimental, that he could no longer defeat Broly on any battlefield. So he stopped trying. He turned instead toward a colder strategy, one that required no armies, only patience and cruelty. He would not break the Saiyan's body. He would break his heart. He began to plan the death of Mark Grayson, not as a soldier, not as a rival, but as the single thread that held the giant to the world. He smiled as he planned it, and the smile was the smile of a man who had finally remembered how to win. Across the galaxy, unaware, Broly laughed at something Mark had said, and the stars above them seemed, for one impossible moment, to laugh with him. The trap was elegant because Thrag had always been an elegant man. He arranged a distress signal on a border world, a false plea from allies Mark would never abandon, and he made certain the ambush was witnessed by drones broadcasting on channels Broly could not help but see. When the explosions came, they were staged for a single audience. When the wreckage settled, the cameras lingered on a shattered helmet and a pool of unmistakable blue and yellow cloth, and every screen in the coalition fleet went silent. Broly saw. Broly believed. For a long moment, he did not move. He simply stood on the bridge of the cruiser where he and Mark had shared a nebula, and he stared at the frozen image on the screen as though waiting for it to correct itself. It did not. Somewhere behind him, someone tried to speak. Someone else tried to touch his arm. He did not feel them. The universe had gone very quiet, the way it had been quiet on the moon where he had first fallen, and inside that quiet something ancient uncoiled. He did not scream. That was the terrible part. He simply walked to the airlock, opened it with a gesture that bent the metal like paper, and stepped out into the void. The green fire that followed him was not the fire the coalition had learned to trust. It was older. It was hungrier. It did not warm the stars around it. It ate them. Galaxies witnessed emerald storms. On worlds 1,000 light-years distant, astronomers watched their sensors register a new kind of weather, a color that should not have existed at that scale, blooming in the direction of the war. Viltrumite squadrons that had been advancing turned and fled without receiving orders. Some of them did not survive the retreat. The ones who did would not speak of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. Thrag himself, watching from a distant flagship, felt something he had not felt in centuries. Not fear exactly, something quieter and more honest. The dawning suspicion that he had misunderstood the nature of the thing he had provoked. Mark was not dead. He had been wounded, badly, and hidden by allies who had not realized how carefully the trap had been staged. When he woke, when he understood, when he saw the sky above him burning green even in daylight, he did not wait for healing. He took a ship and he flew, faster than his body wanted, toward the storm that was eating the war. He found Broly at the center of it, a silhouette against a wound in reality itself. The Saiyan did not recognize him at first. His eyes had gone white, empty of the small, quiet man who had once accepted a canteen in a crater. Mark did not fight him. He could not have fought him. Instead, he flew directly into the storm, arms open, and he called Broly by his name, and he kept calling until his voice broke. Slowly, impossibly, the green began to dim. The storm folded inward. Broly's eyes returned, and when they saw Mark, truly saw him, alive, breathing, bruised and stubborn in there. The giant fell to his knees in the empty air and wept the way mountains weep, without sound, without shame. Mark held him. In the vacuum of space, cradled by nothing but each other, they stayed like that for a long time. Thrag watched from his distant bridge and understood, at last, that he had lost, not the war, something larger, somewhere far away on a small blue world. Debbie Grayson set a loaf of bread on the counter and looked up at the sky as though she had heard someone call her son's name. The final battle was not loud. That surprised everyone who had expected an ending. Broly met Thragg above a dying moon, the coalition fleet holding its breath in a wide, respectful arc. And for a long moment, the two of them only looked at one another across the silent dark. Thragg raised his fists out of habit. Broly raised his out of choice. They fought without rage this time. Every strike from Broly carried the weight of a decision, not an instinct. He no longer struck to end Thragg. He struck to end the idea Thragg had spent a lifetime building. The idea that strength existed only to dominate. When Thragg finally fell, he did not fall because Broly was stronger. He fell because he had run out of arguments, and because the Saiyan who stood above him had become something the Empire had no language for. The Viltrum Empire cracked along seems no one had realized were there. Governors surrendered. Warriors laid down arms and asked, uncertainly, what came next. Some fled into the deep dark to remake themselves. Others stayed, awkwardly, and tried to learn the harder art of building rather than breaking. Years passed, as years do. Broly lived quietly on Earth after that, in a small house near the coast, where the gulls he had once watched with Mark still traced their lazy circles above the waves. He learned to cook badly. He learned to laugh softly. Children in the nearby village grew up knowing him not as a destroyer of worlds, but as the enormous, gentle neighbor who could lift a fallen tree from a rooftop and who always seemed to have time for a question. On Sunday mornings, when the wind was right, the smell of Debbie Grayson's bread drifted across the fields, and Broly would close his eyes and feel, for the first time in any life he could remember, that he had arrived somewhere. Mark reflected often, in interviews and in private, that the galaxy had misunderstood power for most of its history. True power, he said, was never measured by who could conquer galaxies. It was measured by who could refuse to. He said this so often that eventually the children started saying it back to him, which was, he admitted, the point. Some legends reshape history through war. Others reshape history by choosing peace when destruction would be easier. Broly had done both, and in doing both he had finally understood which of the two was harder. Far above the small blue world, in the space where the first fracture had opened, a faint seam remained in the fabric of reality, patient and unhealed. It did not open, not yet. It only waited, the way all doors wait, for the next story to walk through it. And across countless universes, the legendary Super Saiyan finally found something he had searched for all his life. Aomi.